The sun rose over a small, distant island in the Pacific, painting the jungle in hues of gold and shadow. The sound of waves crashing against volcanic rocks could not mask the tension that hung in the humid air. For the soldiers of the United States, every new landing in the Pacific was an exercise in terror. They had fought the German army in Europe, faced tanks, artillery, and fortified bunkers. But nothing in Normandy or North Africa had prepared them for the nightmare of Japanese resistance on these islands. From the first moment of contact, it became clear that this war was unlike any other. Dense jungles swallowed entire companies. Hidden foxholes and tunnels turned the earth into a labyrinth of death. Japanese soldiers, trained in a culture of absolute loyalty and Bushido honor, did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought to the last man. Not for land, but for pride, for the emperor, for a code that placed duty above life itself. A young Marine landing on Peleliu later described it simply. It wasn't the bullets you feared. It was the silence between them. You knew something was waiting for you, and it would not stop. That silence, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves, a sudden volley of gunfire, a hitting grenade, became more terrifying than any tank barreling down a European road. For U.S. soldiers, German armor could be avoided or destroyed with coordinated artillery and airstrikes. Japanese resistance on the islands was different. It was everywhere and nowhere, embedded into the landscape itself, in tunnels, cliffs, caves, and booby traps. Every rock could conceal a machine gun, every tree a sniper, every footprint a potential ambush. The strategy of the Japanese on these islands was both brilliant and brutal. They understood that conventional warfare against the overwhelming industrial and numerical might of the United States was impossible. Tanks could be crushed, bombers shot down, but the human spirit, disciplined, trained, and uncompromising, could inflict terror that no technology could fully counter. Soldiers who had survived hours under the shadow of German panzer divisions found themselves rethinking everything they had learned about combat. Here, courage alone was not enough. Fear became a constant companion, a shadow that whispered in every corner of the jungle. It was not only the fighting that terrified Americans. The psychological warfare began before the first shots were fired. Japanese commanders emphasized the inevitability of death, the sacred duty of sacrifice. Propaganda films, leaflets, and even whispered stories from captured soldiers painted a picture of an enemy who would fight to the death without hesitation, who would leap from cliffs with grenades clutched to their chest, who would feign surrender only to strike in the final instant. The stories, often true, spread through American ranks, amplifying every moment of tension. On Guadalcanal, one of the earliest major engagements in the Pacific theater, the U.S. soldiers quickly realized that the jungles were alive in a way Europe's forests were not. Hidden trails, booby traps, camouflage bunkers, and sudden sniper fire created a sense of constant vulnerability. The Japanese defense was not about numbers or tanks. It was about patience, precision, and a willingness to die for honor. The Americans had artillery, air support, and naval bombardment, yet each advantage was diluted by the ingenuity of the defenders. A single well-placed machine gun nest could hold an entire company at bay. A hidden cave could become a fortress that resisted days of bombing. The psychological toll was enormous. Letters sent home from soldiers during campaigns in Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa spoke of nights where sleep was impossible, of meals eaten in fear, of the sudden loss of comrades in ways that seemed arbitrary and cruel. The Germans in Europe were feared and respected, but there was a predictability to their tactics. Panzer divisions advanced in coordinated formations. Artillery barrages followed intelligence and supply chains. In the Pacific, no two assaults were alike. The landscape itself became a weapon, and the enemy was always adapting, always invisible until the moment of attack. And yet, despite the terror, the Americans pushed forward. Each island was a strategic stepping stone towards Japan, and failure was not an option. Soldiers developed new tactics: flamethrowers to clear caves, hand grenades to flush out hidden defenders, coordinated artillery strikes to collapse tunnels. Medics moved with extreme caution, knowing that even the wounded could be pulled into combat zones or used as bait by Japanese snipers. Despite every technological advantage, the campaign was slow, brutal, and terrifying, a constant test of nerves, endurance, and ingenuity. The first days of battle often determined the character of the entire campaign. On Tarawa, Marines encountered Japanese bunkers so deeply entrenched that artillery rounds had little effect. The first wave of landing craft was decimated. Survivors waded through water under relentless machine gun fire. Every attempt to advance became a deadly negotiation with the island itself. The sand, the coral reefs, the dense foliage, all manipulated by defenders who refused to surrender. Here, German tanks would have been predictable, linear, and vulnerable. Here the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, a lesson in fear that could not be learned in any European textbook. Stories of heroism and tragedy intertwined. Corporal John Basilone at Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Colonel Robert R. Gaylor, and countless other soldiers faced situations that tested every ounce of courage they possessed. Men were lost to hidden traps, sniper fire, and unexpected counterattacks, yet they continued to press forward. The Japanese defenders inspired both fear and respect, fear because their tactics were relentless, respect because they fought with discipline and resolve that seemed almost superhuman. Unlike German soldiers who would surrender when overpowered or surrounded, Japanese fighters often chose death over capture, inflicting maximum casualties before falling themselves. As the sun set on these islands, painting the jungles in deep crimson, American soldiers often paused to reflect on what they had learned. The enemy was not just the man with a rifle or the officer issuing commands. The enemy was the environment itself, made deadly by cunning, patience, and the refusal to surrender. Tanks and artillery could be counted, bombers tracked, and reinforcements estimated. But the human spirit, when fused with training, culture, and environment, was an unpredictable force. On these islands, soldiers learned that fear itself could be engineered, that terrain could be weaponized, and that survival depended not only on firepower, but on wits, nerve, and adaptation. By the time the Marines reached Iwo Jima, the horror was absolute. Every hill, ridge, and cave system had been transformed into a killing ground. Japanese soldiers had prepared intricate tunnel networks, some stretching for miles underground, allowing them to move undetected and strike unexpectedly. Flamethrowers, grenades, and even naval bombardments could not neutralize the threat entirely. The Americans discovered that their conventional strategies, tactics honed in Europe, were only partially effective. The Japanese resistance forced adaptation in real time, pushing soldiers to the brink of exhaustion, despair, and awe. In the evenings, as the moon rose over burned villages and scorched trees, soldiers wrote letters, whispered prayers, and recounted the day's losses. Every victory was measured in lives lost, every advance paid in blood. The German army, for all its brutality, had offered a form of predictability. In the Pacific, even victory felt fragile, temporary, incomplete. The enemy was a shadow, always moving, always waiting, always willing to die. And in that willingness lay the heart of the terror, a psychological weight heavier than any tank, any artillery shell, any machine gun salvo. By the end of Part 1, the Americans understood something vital. The Pacific War was not only about firepower, logistics, or strategy, it was about facing an enemy who had redefined courage, fear, and honor. The Japanese resistance on each island was a mirror reflecting the limits of human endurance and the power of culture to shape combat. And though the Allies would eventually prevail, the lesson would linger. That the enemy the United States feared most in the Pacific was not a machine or weapon, but a people who would fight, die, and resist beyond all expectations.
The dawn over Guadalcanal brought no relief, only a renewed tension that pressed down on every soldier like the humid jungle itself. Every step forward carried the risk of unseen traps, ambushes, and the sudden, brutal violence of a hidden enemy. The Americans quickly learned that the Japanese approach to defense was unlike anything they had faced in Europe. Tanks and artillery could dominate open battlefields, but in these islands, every ridge, every tree, every sand dune could hide a soldier willing to die. The Japanese defenders had a doctrine rooted in a centuries-old code, Bushido, the way of the warrior. Surrender was shameful, death in battle was honor. This principle transformed every engagement into a psychological trial. The Americans, accustomed to encountering enemy soldiers who would surrender when outnumbered or outgunned, were now facing opponents who viewed defeat as a moral impossibility. Each confrontation became a question not only of firepower, but of human resolve. On Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines faced the reality of this unyielding resistance in the dense jungles that stretched for miles. Trees, vines, and thick undergrowth concealed Japanese snipers and machine gun nests. The Americans often moved cautiously, scanning the foliage for signs of movement, yet the enemy was cunning. Snipers would wait for hours, sometimes days, watching, calculating, and striking at the precise moment of vulnerability. The jungle became a labyrinth of terror, a place where visibility was limited and every sound could signal death. Booby traps were ubiquitous. Wooden stakes hidden in the earth, tripwires triggering explosives, pits camouflaged with leaves, all combined to slow progress and sap morale. Soldiers learned to move deliberately, probing the ground with sticks, yet even the most cautious patrol could be undone by a single invisible trap. Entire squads were sometimes lost before they even reached the Japanese defensive lines. The Americans understood quickly that in this environment, the enemy controlled the tempo of battle. They dictated when and how engagements would occur, and each attack was designed to maximize casualties and psychological strain. Tarawa, in the Gilbert Islands, exemplified the extreme of this tactical ingenuity. The coral reefs surrounding the island made landing nearly impossible, and yet the Japanese defenders have prepared extensive fortifications that exploited the geography. The Marines' amphibious vehicles became trapped on the reefs under heavy fire, forcing men to wade through chest-deep water into a hail of bullets. The Japanese soldiers, positioned in fortified bunkers and reinforced pillboxes, fired relentlessly. Retreat was impossible, surrender unheard of. Each Marine who fell became a cautionary tale to the next wave. And yet, the Marines pressed forward. Courage was essential, but it was courage tested against the kind of relentless, fanatical resistance that defied logic. On Peleliu, the nightmare escalated. The Japanese had spent months tunneling through the volcanic terrain, creating networks of caves and bunkers that allowed them to survive bombardments and move undetected. The Americans initially believed the island could be secured in days, yet the fighting stretched into weeks, with each advance costing staggering numbers of men. Flamethrowers, grenades, and artillery proved partially effective, but could not eliminate the defenders entirely. Each bunker became a miniature fortress, each cave an arena for prolonged combat where lives were lost in minutes. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers fought not just the enemy, but their own exhaustion, fear, and despair. The Americans also faced an enemy who understood improvisation in combat. Japanese soldiers were trained to use every element of the environment to their advantage. Mudslides, falling trees, even swarms of insects became tools in a war of attrition. Soldiers learned that to survive, they could not simply rely on brute force. They had to anticipate, adapt, and respect the enemy's ingenuity. Unlike in Europe, where tactics and equipment often determined outcomes, in the Pacific, intelligence, observation, and instinct became as critical as ammunition and artillery. Yet, for every horror, there were stories of incredible heroism. Medics risked their lives to drag wounded comrades from open fire. Small units executed daring flanking maneuvers through swamp and jungle, overcoming the impossible with strategy, teamwork, and resolve. The Americans developed new methods to deal with fortified positions. Flamethrowers to clear caves, specialized demolition teams, coordinated artillery barrages, and combined air and naval attacks. These adaptations were not perfect, but they represented the relentless ingenuity of soldiers confronting a uniquely fanatical foe. Iwo Jima became the ultimate test of this brutal calculus. The Japanese defenders, commanded by General Tadamichi Kobayashi, had learned from previous island campaigns. They refused the traditional pattern of defending beaches and instead created an interior defense in depth. Every hill was fortified, every bunker camouflaged, and miles of tunnels connected positions. Kobayashi's strategy ensured that Americans could never gain a decisive advantage quickly. The Marines faced fire from hidden positions that seemed impossible to locate. Explosions erupted without warning, and soldiers fell in groups, or alone, often without seeing the enemy who struck them. The psychological dimension of this resistance cannot be overstated. Soldiers wrote home about the endless tension, the relentless fear, the haunting silence between attacks. The enemy was omnipresent, yet invisible. Combat was not a series of battles, but a continuous, grinding test of nerve. Men who had faced German panzer divisions described these islands as far more terrifying. There, they said, the enemy did not yield, they did not surrender, they did not retreat, and they were willing to die to maximize the enemy's suffering. Yet, the Americans persisted. Each island, though soaked in blood and suffering, became a stepping stone toward Japan itself. Lessons learned under fire, how to clear caves, navigate jungles, anticipate ambushes, were invaluable. Soldiers developed unprecedented levels of coordination, communication, and resilience. They also developed a profound respect for the enemy. In letters and diaries, Marines often described their Japanese foes as disciplined, brave, and terrifying. They understood that these men were not mindless killers, but soldiers shaped by a culture that valued honor and death over surrender. The battles also revealed the complexity of human behavior in war. Civilians, often caught between the Japanese military and American attacks, suffered unspeakably. Villages burned, crops destroyed, and families displaced. Yet within this chaos, soldiers observed acts of humanity. Japanese medics tending to their wounded, civilians risking their lives to aid children, and American soldiers rescuing non-combatants amidst gunfire. The contrast between extreme fanaticism and fleeting humanity created a moral tension that haunted every participant. By the end of Part 2, the Americans had grasped the full scope of Pacific combat. This was a war not of equipment or numbers alone, but of psychology, endurance, and cultural resolve. Tanks, artillery, and air power could dominate in Europe, but on these islands, courage, cunning, and a willingness to die made Japanese resistance uniquely formidable. Soldiers who survived often carried the scars, mental, emotional, and physical, long after the battles ended. They understood that they had faced not only an enemy army, but a force that embodied the relentless will of a nation willing to sacrifice everything for honor.
Peleliu, a single word, became a synonym for nightmare among American forces. The island, small in size yet colossal in its resistance, was intended to be secured quickly to provide air support for upcoming campaigns. Instead, it became a crucible of blood, fire, and psychological torment. The Japanese defenders, numbering just over 10,000, had transformed Peleliu into an almost impenetrable fortress. Hills were hollowed into bunkers, caves connected by tunnels snaked beneath the volcanic soil, and every rock or ridge had been fortified with machine guns, mortars, or snipers. The Marines quickly realized that their usual tactics were insufficient. This was no ordinary battlefield. It was an ecosystem of death, meticulously designed to maximize fear and casualties. The first waves of landing craft struck the reefs, where coral tore hulls apart and forced men to wade through deep, enemy-patrolled waters. Japanese gunners awaited with precision, firing relentlessly at exposed soldiers. Those who made it to the shore faced immediate counterattacks, grenades hurled from hidden vantage points, and flamethrowers from bunkers that had survived pre-invasion bombardments. Every step inland demanded focus, courage, and a constant awareness that any misstep could be the last. Inside the bunkers, Japanese soldiers fought with a discipline that both horrified and awed the Americans. Men were trained to fire until death or until ammunition ran out. They would feign retreat to lure enemy forces into kill zones, then strike with sudden, devastating precision. In one memorable instance, a platoon advancing through a hillside was ambushed from 3 different caves simultaneously. Explosions shattered the ground, gunfire cut through the smoke, and yet the defenders held their positions, emerging only to meet reinforcements with the same lethal resolve. The psychological impact of this resistance was immense.
Marines described the sensation of never knowing where the next attack would come from, whether it would be a sniper, a booby trap, or a grenade dropped from a hidden ledge. Sleep became impossible. Hunger and exhaustion worsened the tension, and the constant presence of death etched itself into every man's consciousness. Letters home described a horror unlike any experienced in Europe. German tanks could be observed, calculated, and neutralized. On Peleliu, the enemy was invisible, everywhere, and capable of striking with deadly precision from any angle. Okinawa intensified the nightmare. The island, larger and strategically crucial, became the stage for the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. The Japanese defenders, numbering over 100,000, were prepared for total sacrifice. Fortifications extended across hills, caves, and villages, with entire underground networks connecting positions. Kamikaze attacks from the skies compounded the terror as kamikaze pilots targeted ships, landing craft, and ports. Every assault was a blend of conventional and unconventional warfare, forcing American soldiers to adapt continuously. Urban combat added another layer of complexity. Japanese troops infiltrated villages, hiding in homes, under floors, and even among civilian populations. Ambushes occurred in narrow streets, often leaving entire squads cut off. Snipers perched in ruined buildings could strike from dozens of meters away, forcing Americans to advance with extreme caution. Mines and booby traps awaited at every step. Even the terrain itself, steep cliffs and muddy ravines, became weapons in the hands of the Japanese. Every successful advance felt temporary. The cost in lives was astronomical. The Americans developed specialized tactics to survive and prevail. Flamethrowers became essential for clearing caves and bunkers. Engineers built improvised bridges to cross difficult terrain under fire. Artillery and naval bombardment softened positions before assaults, yet the Japanese defense absorbed punishment and adapted. Soldiers learned that patience, observation, and coordination were as crucial as bravery. Heroism was not just about charging forward. It was about calculating risks, covering comrades, and maintaining morale amid chaos. Amid the carnage, stories of individual heroism emerged. Marines dragged wounded comrades across open fire. Medics braved sniper lines to administer aid, and small units executed daring flanking maneuvers that turned the tide of localized engagements. Yet even these acts came at a staggering cost. Entire companies were wiped out by ambushes, booby traps, or hidden machine guns. Letters and diaries captured the despair of watching friends fall in ways that seemed cruelly arbitrary. Yet the determination to continue never wavered. Soldiers understood that surrender was not an option. Each island represented a stepping stone toward Japan, and failure could prolong the war and cost even more lives. The resilience of the Japanese defenders was equally remarkable. Trained from youth in military schools and imbued with the principles of Bushido, soldiers prioritized honor and sacrifice above survival. They fought not for land or resources, but for a code that placed duty above life. The psychological impact on the Americans was profound. Facing an enemy that refused to surrender forced them to rethink conventional warfare. Combat was no longer a linear contest of firepower. It was a test of nerve, endurance, and adaptability. Each victory was hard-won, each gain measured in blood. Iwo Jima demonstrated the ultimate combination of terrain, tactics, and unyielding resistance. Japanese soldiers, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, transformed the island's interior into a defense in depth. The Americans could not simply overwhelm the enemy with bombardment. They had to fight for every inch. Massive caves and tunnels allowed defenders to move unseen and launch attacks from unexpected angles. Casualties were enormous, and progress was painstakingly slow. Yet, despite the horror, the Marines adapted, learning how to clear tunnels systematically, coordinate artillery, and maintain morale under continuous stress. The Pacific campaigns revealed that the American military had underestimated the psychological and cultural dimension of Japanese resistance. German tanks could be tracked, anticipated, and countered. The Japanese, however, fought with a relentless, fanatical resolve that often defied logic. They used terrain, psychology, and sheer discipline as weapons, creating an environment in which even the most skilled and experienced soldiers were challenged to survive. It was a form of warfare unlike any seen before, and unlike any that would be seen again. By the end of Part 3, the Americans had confronted the terrifying truth. Victory in the Pacific demanded more than firepower. It required understanding, adaptation, and endurance. Soldiers had faced the full spectrum of human ingenuity, bravery, and fanaticism. The Japanese defenders had created a unique hell on each island, forcing the Allies to evolve tactics, strategies, and mental resilience. Tanks and artillery were not enough. Victory depended on courage, intelligence, and a willingness to face an enemy who had redefined what it meant to fight to the last breath.
Okinawa. The name alone would haunt soldiers for decades. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific theater, it was designed to be the final stepping stone toward Japan itself. Yet it quickly became a crucible of unimaginable terror. Over 100,000 Japanese defenders, entrenched in fortified positions across cliffs, caves, and villages, were determined to inflict maximum casualties. Their strategy combined conventional defense with guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and suicidal fanaticism. Every step forward by the Americans was met with precision gunfire, hidden explosives, and sudden, unexpected attacks from underground tunnels that seemed endless. From the first hours of the landing, the Marines and Army soldiers realized that this battle was unlike any other. The Japanese had studied previous island defenses and learned from each engagement. No longer did they rely solely on coastal fortifications. Instead, they created interior networks that allowed movement and attack without exposure. Each hill became a fortress, each cave a deadly trap. Soldiers advancing through villages encountered ambushes at every corner. Snipers perched in ruined buildings could strike without warning, while hidden mortars rained death on anyone exposed. The familiar strategies of Europe, tanks, artillery, and coordinated infantry attacks, were only partially effective. In these islands, even the best-trained units found themselves vulnerable, exhausted, and terrified. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of American soldiers fell, and the landscape itself became a graveyard. Entire villages were leveled, forests turned into a maze of fire and smoke, and every day brought new horrors. Yet the Americans pressed on, driven by necessity, training, and the knowledge that the path to Japan lay through these islands. Survival required constant vigilance, improvisation, and courage under conditions that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. The psychological toll of Okinawa was unparalleled. Soldiers faced not only a relentless enemy, but the constant uncertainty of death from invisible sources. Mines, booby traps, hidden bunkers, and snipers created an environment where every move could be fatal. Exhaustion, hunger, and sleep deprivation compounded the terror. Letters and diaries from the battlefield describe soldiers walking with numbness, adrenaline, and fear as constant companions. Even the most experienced veterans from Europe remarked that the Japanese defense had rewritten their understanding of warfare. The enemy was not just a soldier, it was an idea, a philosophy of total commitment, and a relentless embodiment of a nation's will. Kamikaze attacks added another dimension of terror. Suicide pilots targeted ships, landing craft, and supply lines with devastating precision. Entire decks of naval vessels could be destroyed in minutes. For soldiers on shore, the knowledge that their reinforcements could be obliterated at any moment heightened the tension. Every mission became a delicate balance of aggression and caution as commanders struggled to maintain momentum while minimizing losses. Japanese tactics had transformed each island into a theater of constant terror, where the psychological stakes were as high as the physical. Despite the fear, acts of heroism and extraordinary courage were everywhere. Medics frost open fire to save the wounded, small units executed daring maneuvers through treacherous terrain, and officers made split-second decisions that saved lives while advancing objectives. Each victory came at an immense cost, yet it was a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Soldiers learned to respect their enemy's ingenuity while pushing forward with grim determination. The fanaticism of the Japanese defenders reached its peak during the final days of the battle. Soldiers, trapped and surrounded, often chose death over surrender. Using grenades, improvised explosives, and last-ditch counterattacks to inflict maximum casualties. Villages were abandoned only after every defender was killed or incapacitated. The Americans faced a reality that no tank or artillery barrage could change. The Japanese resistance was rooted in a culture that revered death over defeat. This cultural dimension transformed every engagement into a psychological trial, where fear, ingenuity, and discipline became weapons as lethal as bullets. American soldiers came to understand that the horror of the Pacific was unique. In Europe, enemy soldiers could be captured or persuaded to surrender. Tanks could be anticipated and destroyed, artillery barrages could break lines. In the Pacific, the enemy was omnipresent, invisible, and fanatically committed. The jungle, the hills, the caves, every part of the environment had been turned into a weapon. Each island was a trial, testing endurance, nerve, and morality. Combat was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about surviving the nightmare they had engineered. The aftermath of these battles revealed the staggering scale of sacrifice. Thousands of soldiers, both American and Japanese, lay dead in jungles, villages, and beaches. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered enormously. Entire communities were destroyed, leaving scars that would last for generations. Yet within this devastation, lessons emerged. Americans learned the value of adaptability, small unit tactics, and psychological preparation. Commanders refined strategies for dealing with hidden, fanatical resistance. Soldiers developed an acute awareness of the interplay between environment, enemy behavior, and human endurance. The fear instilled by Japanese resistance was not just physical, it was psychological, moral, and cultural. Soldiers faced an enemy who refused to surrender, who turned every hill and cave into a trap, and who imbued combat with a sense of existential purpose. This fanaticism made conventional strategies insufficient and forced the Allies to innovate. They learned that victory required more than firepower. It demanded respect for the enemy, mental resilience, and a willingness to endure horrors beyond imagining. By the time the islands were secured, the cost was clear. The Americans had gained strategic positions, but at immense human expense. Every victory was measured in lives lost, each step forward a testament to courage under unimaginable pressure. The Japanese defenders, though ultimately defeated, had rewritten the rules of warfare for the Pacific. They had transformed terrain, culture, and psychology into weapons more terrifying than any tank or artillery piece. Their resistance was fanatical, lethal, and relentless, a lesson in the limits of human endurance and the terrifying power of cultural conviction. In retrospect, the Pacific Campaign stands as a testament to both the horrors of war and the extremes of human courage. Soldiers who survived carried scars that would never fully heal, yet they also carried knowledge, adaptability, and respect for the enemy's ingenuity. The Japanese defenders, for all their fanaticism, demonstrated discipline, commitment, and the power of ideology to shape combat. Tanks, bombs, and firepower could not replicate the fear inspired by a determined human enemy embedded in a hostile environment. As the sun set over the ruins of Okinawa, the lessons were clear. The enemy the United States feared most in the Pacific was not the equipment, the numbers, or even the strategy. It was the unyielding, disciplined, fanatical human spirit willing to sacrifice everything to inflict maximum resistance. The islands had become theaters of death, crucibles of courage, and places where ordinary soldiers were transformed by fear, determination, and the unrelenting reality of total war. And so the Pacific Campaign ended, strategically victorious for the Allies, yet forever seared into memory as a war like no other. The Japanese resistance had taught lessons that would resonate for generations, that courage, discipline, and fanaticism can transform ordinary terrain into a nightmare, that fear can be weaponized as effectively as any tank or gun, and that human endurance, tested against unimaginable odds, is the true measure of both horror and heroism. In the end, the Pacific Islands bore witness to a unique chapter of warfare in which the enemy's commitment to death, discipline, and cultural honor made them far more formidable than any armored division. The Marines and soldiers who survived emerged not only as victors, but as participants in a war that had redefined the boundaries of fear, courage, and human resolve. They had faced an enemy unlike any other. And the memory of that resistance would linger long after the battles had ended, teaching the world the terrifying power of the human spirit when fused with fanatical determination.